It is the Muscle and Feels podcast, episode 2. Same clothes, same spot. We are out here grinding 24/7. Haven't slept, haven't eaten, haven't moved. Here to bring you the ultimate podcast experience, the best thing that has ever happened in fitness. Even
the internet.
Yeah, well, no, okay, relax now. But yeah, much better than barbells or plates. Muscle and Feels podcast, episode 2. We're here. I'm one of your hosts, the chunkier, to put it nicely, and less hairy on my head, but more hairy body-wise, Pack.
You remind me of the hippo in Madagascar.
A few people have said that, actually. What's his name? Tomo?
Yeah.
Momo?
Something like that.
Anyways, shout out to that guy. Milo Wolf on my left. The real Milo.
Moto,
Milo
there we
Croton.
go.
Moto. You know the vibes.
The resemblance is uncanny. Anyways, me, Milo Wolf, less bald, longer beard now, oddly enough. Competing in bodybuilding. That's basically the only difference between us.
Exactly. And one is Greek and one is not, but everybody's Greek because Greeks invented everything.
Actually, there is one difference I can think of.
What is that?
We've done different PhD projects.
Oh, snap. What a nice transition. I wanted to keep the intro going for more, but sure. Yes, we have. What was yours on?
Well, mine is, actually.
Uh-huh.
So yours was, as you've now finished your PhD.
RIP. Actually, a year since I defended. The year and minus 4 days.
Physically. You fighted the examiners.
I want the PhD. Get out of here, fatso. You're not studying. You're not doing a PhD. I want a PhD. And then I ended up buying one online.
After a lengthy legal battle.
Legal battle with my parents so they could give me some money to buy it.
Anyways, my PhD is on range of motion and muscle strength and hypertrophy.
The topic, I mean, it's somewhat appropriate that you are wearing an RP t-shirt because tank top, because they are one of those evidence-based groups that have made a big deal about range of motion and more specifically implementing a full range of motion. Range of motion in general and hypertrophy is something, I mean, we have actually started as the range of motion podcast because we spoke about the IPF bench rule. Now we're speaking about your PhD, which is range of motion. What's next, Milo?
I actually think our first episode was quite
planned?
magical because we combined powerlifting or strength training, which is kind of your wheelhouse, but also range of motion. So best of both worlds, a marriage of convenience, as I'm sure ours will eventually be.
Indeed. And it seems just like 10 minutes ago when we shot that podcast. It feels very recent. So,
Indeed.
Range of motion. We've seen, we've laughed, we've cried at people lifting with small range of motion. I've cried and laughed at Milo lifting with an insanely increased range of motion, aka doing a stiff leg deadlift off of
2 plates.
Two bumper plates. And in general, it's something that when you become a proper lifter, you are concerned about. We've all done our half reps at some point. Either we wanted it or not.
Yesterday evening for me.
We've all done our half reps and told ourselves those count back in the day, aka yesterday. And in general, it's a topic that is very important and dear to us lifters. So, allow me to ask, how did you get the idea for your PhD? What gave birth to this body of literature that is your PhD?
Sure. So a combination of 2 things. The first was I was following RP to some extent for a few years.
Renaissance periodization,
Indeed.
for those of you that don't know.
The gang. Not affiliated with them in any major way at the moment, so nothing I say is directly their view or anything like that.
Everything I say is directly their views.
Specifically,
Mike Israel's
exactly.
views. I have been legally authorized to speak on his behalf.
And there's a resemblance between them when he has a beard. So
Send me money.
Indeed. Anyhow, so I got into range of motion because I was kind of following along with RP stuff for a while when I was an undergrad in sports science. And so I started getting interested in range of motion, initially mostly in the form of let's maximize range of motion because that's what seemed to be best based on the information sources I was consuming. And also, let's standardize it over time, meaning it's consistent so that we can track progress and measure it as well. And then when I was nearing the end of my undergrad, so my bachelor's degree in sports science, I was thinking about next steps. And one of the options was to do a PhD. And one idea, obviously, that I was interested in was range of motion. And I just so happened to read an article in Mass, actually.
Shout out Mass.
Shout out to Mass.
If you haven't subscribed and you're a lifter, consider subscribing. Mass Research Review. Google it.
Anyways, I read an article there. I think it was reviewing, I'm pretty sure it was reviewing, the Schoenfeld Systematic Review of 2020 on the effects of range of motion on muscle hypertrophy. And that was also the year that I was applying for a PhD. And so I was like, Mr. Knuckles is putting forth some good ideas about future studies regarding range of motion.
Oh, wow.
And so I put together a PhD proposal, sent it to my now supervisors, and the rest is history.
How did you have because it's not conventional for those because I assume people from all over the globe are watching, in the US and in the UK as well, and I think in most parts of the world it's not very conventional to go from a bachelor's directly to a PhD. I did some research in between. I'll talk about that in a separate episode, but as far as I recall, you were a top student at your university, which I think is one of the best in the UK for sports science, so that obviously helped.
Literally the best in the world, 4 years in a row.
The best in the world?
Loughborough University, yeah.
Wow.
Well, depends on the rankings, let's be honest. The rankings are all a bit rigged, but hey.
Yeah, the criteria is, anyways, what it is. So, did you have a chat with some of the academics at your university? Did anybody say, yeah, that's a good idea, you're probably going to be able to do it? Because most people assume
they can't.
They can't, yeah.
Indeed. So in my case, I was really exploring my options. There was a time frame around maybe the last 3 to 6 months before I finished my last year of my undergraduate studies, where I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, and I think this is very relatable. Like every undergrad student, even postgrad student in the last few months is freaking out, figuring out what they want to do, what they should do, and so forth. So for me, I was hesitating between a few options. One was doing online coaching full-time, just straight up. And obviously, at the time, my online coaching business wasn't as big as it is now, so it would have been quite a tight fit, would have been risk. The second option would have been pursuing a master's degree, but the downside to that was, as with my undergrad degrees in sports science are generally quite broad and general, for lack of a better term. And so if you're pretty certain you're only interested in one area, or mainly interested in one, namely resistance training, lifting weights, getting these guns.
No guns included, just Milo's biceps for anybody listening to the podcast.
CNC supply. It didn't make sense for me to pursue a master's where I would only be learning about sort of general sports science for yet another year or two. And so another option would have been to go into data science, or statistics actually, which shout out to Eric Trexler, yet another shout out to Strong by Science related things or people. They were doing an AMA on Reddit, and I asked a question about what my next step should be, and he was like, maybe you should consider doing a master's in data science or statistics because it would broaden your career prospects, make you able to interpret research pretty well. So if you want to stay in sports science or coaching, that would work. But it would also allow you to work in any number of other fields, which would have been very helpful. Anyways, that was an option, and I did apply for quite a few masters in that sense. But ultimately, it's quite hard to get into a separate field entirely if you have no prior education, right? Like if you don't have an undergrad in statistics, getting into a master's program for statistics is very difficult.
You may be able to get into it.
It's difficult unless you really downgrade your university, for example.
Sure, but I think the real issue would be, because I started thinking about it while you said it, I thought, wow, that could be cool. And at this stage now, you could go into a master's and say, hey guys, I have a PhD and I'd like to do a master's in data science, and I've published some research and done some data analysis. Chances are they'd accept you, at least in most UK universities. Maybe not the best of the best, but you'd still be able to go to a good university. But then I think the master's itself, the whole year,
would be a slog.
It would be a slog, and it would be much less time efficient than doing a master's in, I don't know, nutrition or something. You have
indeed an easy topic.
for somebody who knows the topic.
Indeed. Also, in general, I think
nutritionists now are
easier.
disliking
And they disliking leaving hate
Dear
comments.
Milo.
Nutrition is an 80-hour a week subject to study. You know nothing about nutrition, and to be fair, I don't. Anyways, so those were my options, and then finally there was this one strange option of pursuing a PhD. So I want to say, I'm not sure how I came across this idea. I think what happened was I emailed my now supervisors, James Fisher specifically, about doing a master's here at the university I'm currently doing a PhD at, because I knew that there were researchers here doing science that I care about, aka lifting weights. And so when you're applying for postgraduate degrees, one thing to really look for is to see what sort of studies, papers are coming out of that university, and what sort of researchers or lecturers there are, and what they specialize in.
Exactly.
Because in my undergrad, I had lecturers specializing in hydration and combat sports, which, fair enough, more power to you, but not my shtick. And so I emailed my supervisors now about the master's program and asked them, hey, do you think this would be pretty specific to lifting, since a lot of your research is about lifting? And essentially they told me, no, to be honest, based on your situation, your best bet would be to apply for a PhD. And so that's exactly what I did. And a few weeks later, I think I sent him a PhD proposal. And after an interview, I was accepted. And that's how I started doing my PhD.
And then we met.
Indeed, very soon thereafter.
Nice. So you start your PhD. Obviously, the journey of a PhD has multiple stages. A lot of figuring stuff out, but I think you were one of the exceptions, because even I spent a year preparing for something somewhat different, and then I got into my topic. But you came and knew that it's going to be range of motion and muscle growth. Did that change?
Yeah, so to be clear, initially it was going to be 3 studies where we're going to have people train with either a partial or full range of motion, and seeing which approach led to more hypertrophy and strength adaptations. So what would make you grow muscle and what would make you get more strong. But eventually that plan was sort of changed, mostly due to resource constraints. So like running 3 experimental studies where you have people training in the lab for a couple hours a week, that's a lot of work. And getting enough people to make those studies informative is difficult. The bigger your data set, the more informative your study is.
Mm-hmm.
And so running a study with like 5 people in it wouldn't make for a very good study. And so it wasn't really a wise decision to try and do 3 of those studies. And in the end, I decided to refocus my PhD's topic on not just hypertrophy, but hypertrophy and strength.
Nice. One thing I wanted to mention for some of the viewers that may not be familiar with how PhDs are done in the UK, in contrast to US-based PhDs, and I think I'm right, maybe I'm not right for every sort of field, but there's no classes in the UK. It's essentially, hey, it's my PhD. Okay, go ahead with it if it's self-funded. If it's funded, obviously, and you're doing it under a specific supervisor for a specific topic that they're running, the processes are different. Yours was self-funded. Mine was self-funded as well. So it was as simple as, okay, this is my idea. Whatever, you get accepted. Cool. To discuss with your supervisor, off you go, and there's a few sort of exams and checkpoints at various different time points.
Yeah, pretty much. And so in opposition or in contrast to PhDs in America, or North America as a whole, I guess, typically here it's around 3 to 4 years full-time and maybe 6 to 8 part-time, whereas in the US, from my understanding of things, it's consistently like 5+ years with lectures involved and so forth. So yeah, that's essentially how I got into doing a PhD on range of motion to begin with.
You're there, you have your topic, you've made some adjustments to the initial planning. What did you know before you started doing your own research and your own literature review? What was your prior knowledge before starting the PhD around range of motion and hypertrophy and strength?
So my prior knowledge around range of motion and hypertrophy was that there weren't many studies out there yet, and that most of them were on the lower body, specifically regarding hypertrophy. And that generally speaking, the results pretty consistently favored a full range of motion, and that there weren't enough studies overall to say much about the upper body yet. And that was essentially it.
I have a quote that is very fitting to this.
What are we doing here?
You'll see.
Ah, yes. I know which one you're referring to.
All right. Okay. Cool. You mentioned that most of the studies were on the lower body.
That's correct.
That's true. So the only thing I have to say, as Jason Genova once said, like I said, you have the lower body and you have no upper body. You got a problem. You got a problem building. Wait a minute. You have the upper body and you have no legs. You have the upper body and you have no legs. You got a problem building your legs. You have the lower body and you don't have the upper body. The upper body, it's easier to build. So if you have the lower body and you don't have the upper body, it's easier to build the upper body. You have the upper body and you don't have the legs. You got a problem building the lower body. No, Milo, you don't understand. You have the upper body. You don't have the lower body. You got a problem building downstairs. You got the legs on the bottom. It is easier to build the top. Yeah. And that's your PhD summed up. Thank you for tuning in to this episode. Yeah, so few studies out there, mostly lower body. Mostly or only lower body?
At the time, there were 2 studies on the upper body and hypertrophy.
And the consensus among the lifting community was what? That's a weird question.
The lifting community as a whole, which would probably be something like, yeah, you should keep active tension or keep those muscle groups active during the lift, so never lock out or never get a full stretch.
In the bodybuilding community, at least.
Yeah, so active range of motion. I'm not even sure what it's called anymore.
Yeah, and that was also a thing in other circles as well. I noticed when speaking to a few people over in the States, so the lockout was avoided.
Yeah, so I think that was a thing and still is a thing within the broader fitness space to keep the tension on the muscle by never locking out and never getting a good stretch on the muscle. And then within the evidence-based community, I think there were, broadly speaking, 2 camps. One camp who didn't think range of motion mattered all that much, but still had a long range of motion, right? Like most people who didn't talk about range of motion much were like, yeah, you squat to depth and you don't worry about it too much otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was another camp within the evidence-based fitness community that really took range of motion to its extreme because the view was, more range of motion is better. Such as, for example, at the time, I think RP was very invested in that topic.
Yeah, and still is. And that was obviously in the context of, hey, maximizing hypertrophy rather than whatever, train for general strength and muscle. And that is all very interesting because by the end of the episode, and because you've really looked at the literature and you have your meta-analysis coming up and you've also started your other studies, I think the listener will be able to get a slight preview of who was right.
Indeed.
Everyone. But yeah, cool. So let's dive into the nitty-gritty of your PhD. What happened there? I just suddenly lost hair, my beard got trimmed and shaped, and Wolfpack interrupted the podcast to tell us how much better they are and flex their title by sending us bags. Well, we take this personally, and we'll see you in court. So, just to resume. Oh my god, another energy drink appeared. As you can tell here, I am the caffeine aficionado of this duo. So, the nitty-gritty of your PhD. Walk us through it, dear Milo.
Sure. So currently, as part of my PhD, I'm doing 4 studies. The first was a meta-analysis on the current evidence on the effects of range of motion on strength and hypertrophy, and also other outcomes like jump height and sprint duration, that sort of stuff.
List them all.
Fine. Muscle size, strength, power type outcomes like rate of force development, sport type outcomes like sprint duration and jump height, and finally body fat type outcomes, simply put, just how much fat you have as illustrated here.
A healthy amount, 36.8 inch waist.
Indeed. So that's the first study. It was a meta-analysis. Then the second and third studies were pretty similar in terms of what they were. The first one was a survey study where essentially I got around 750 people in and asked them questions about their perception of range of motion, what they use in training, why they use it, why they don't use alternative methods, what their perception of the evidence is around range of motion, and that sort of stuff. And then the interviews were similar, but where the surveys looked at the general population, so essentially anyone training for strength or hypertrophy, The interviews were more so geared towards interviewing people within the strength and physique sports. So that would be physique athletes, so bodybuilding athletes, classic physique, whatever, all the divisions, and also strength sports like strongman, weightlifting, powerlifting, and so forth.
And CrossFit.
Indeed. And then finally, the last study, which I'm actually starting now, is an actual intervention study where I'm having people train their two calves using different protocols. So one calf is assigned to a partial range of motion condition where they're training their calf using half the usual range of motion in the lengthened part of the range of motion. And then they're training the other calf with a full range of motion. And by using a within subject design, so using the same person but separate limbs, it allows us to have a greater degree of control over confounders like nutrition, like PhDs, like all sorts of stuff that you otherwise wouldn't. And so it just allows you to have greater power and greater confidence in your findings than you would if you had a between subject design where there's confounders like how much people sleep, what their diet was like, what their stress was like, and so forth. So those are the 4 studies: the meta-analysis, the survey study, the interview study, and the intervention study.
That's amazing. Are you the one doing the ultrasound for the latest study?
I am, in fact, the one doing the ultrasounds.
So you did not blind the ultrasound technician?
I did not blind the ultrasounds, and that reference will be lost on many people.
The few that will get it, will appreciate it, and be long-time listeners. So let's just have a look at, actually, if you want to expand a bit more on your meta-analysis, because I think that will be a core paper. I think you didn't mention that you're planning on publishing all, if not most, of the findings, not just as your thesis, like one normally does with their PhD via their university website, but as separate papers as well, right?
Yeah, correct. So following in the great Androulakis Korakakis' footsteps, currently drinking 2 energy drinks at once.
PhD.
He essentially published all of his studies, except for one, the meta-analysis, combined into one paper. Oh.
2 were not published in that paper. The pilot study as well.
Okay, bro. Pilot study, schmalot study. What's a pilot study?
It was...
What did you do for a pilot study?
For the pilot study, we looked at, the minimum dose, just single sets, single sets of 1 rep in powerlifters. It was a well-designed study, actually, but the sample was very small.
Oh, yeah. Okay, fair enough. Anyways, so I'll be combining my survey study, my interview study, and my training study into one paper, and then also publishing my meta-analysis as a standalone project, just because I think it's worth, publishing on its own.
Yeah, for sure. And I don't think having the meta-analysis in a multi-experiment paper the multi-experiment paper in itself is something that is not common in sports science at all. Yeah. It's very common in fields like psychology, very common, somewhat more common at least. And the merit to that is, especially in topics that are that are still somewhat new, and there's a bit of a gap in the literature, it allows you to have a better overview of the current available evidence. Plus, it, I think, makes it less difficult for people to locate that evidence, especially in a topic like yours or mine, where those papers would have similar titles. So it would be the effects of partial versus full range of motion on this, an interview study, then a similar title, a survey study. Although a lot of academics would be like, but that's extra publications, that's extra stats, that's hashtag academia the game. Aside from that, it doesn't make much sense to put them out there.
Yeah, I agree. It just makes for a more coherent reading as well, because the survey study does, inform us regarding people's practices in the field with regards to range of motion. But on its own, it's not that helpful. But I think having it as one paper makes it a lot more coherent.
Exactly. So meta-analysis, a lot of sub-analyses. You looked at a ton of stuff, and you addressed some of the gaps in the literature, to the best of your ability. It was a collaborative effort because it was mainly you and Dr. James Steele on the stats.
Associate Professor James Steele to you.
Associate Professor Dr. James Steele, FHSEA.
If that's even correct.
I think it's something like that. So yeah, talk us through the sub-analysis and what you found.
Yeah, so we found a lot of things, but before we get into that, I think this camera's running out of battery.
Is it? Oh yeah, it is. Transition. And wow, we're back again. Some stuff is missing. There's a glass cat over there. Another seamless transition. We didn't get interrupted for the 25th time today. Over to you, Milo, to talk about the sub-analyses.
Yeah, so by and large, we ran two types of analyses. One is called a subgroup analysis, which is when you take a subset of the data and compare that instead of the whole data, right? So for example, that might look like looking at only hypertrophy outcomes and comparing partial range of motion when it's performed at short muscle lengths versus when it's performed at long muscle lengths, and comparing those separated into two groups, two for range of motion, to see, okay, when partial range of motion is being done at long muscle lengths, is it better than full range of motion or worse? Versus when it's being done at short muscle lengths, how does that stack up against full range of motion? So that's the subgroup analysis. We also did something called a meta-regression, which is essentially when you view a variable as continuous, like for example, height, right? Height goes from, say, on average, something like 5 foot to 6'5" for most people. You can then see, okay, as we go from your height being 5 foot or 5 feet to your height being 6'5", how does the outcome we care about change? So for example, as your height goes from 5 foot to 6'5", do we see that the relationship between full range of motion and hypertrophy changes, such that taller people might do better or worse with a full range of motion? So by and large, those were the two types of analyses we did. I think the most interesting ones are as follows. The main one was, on the whole, the effects are trivial to small. So whether you're training with full or partial range of motion doesn't seem to matter a whole lot for most outcomes. Now, for most outcomes, using a full range of motion does seem to do better by a small to trivial amount. For hypertrophy specifically, we separated the interventions into being a partial range of motion at long muscle lengths or at short muscle lengths. And it seems like when a partial range of motion is being performed at long muscle lengths, it may be better for hypertrophy than a full range of motion. And when a partial range of motion is being performed at short muscle lengths, so, top of a bicep curl, for example, versus the bottom being lengthened, generally that seems to be worse than full range of motion for hypertrophy. Then when it comes to strength, it does seem as though what we did is we categorized outcomes as being either biased towards a full range of motion. So for example, a full range of motion squat on rep max, right? Because the outcome you care about here is a full range of motion squat, the strength test is inherently biased towards the full range of motion group, right? Because you train the outcome. So there's a bias towards that condition. And when we grouped strength outcomes that way, it seemed as though training in a certain range of motion generally produces better outcomes in terms of strength and power adaptations. So for example, if your aim is to maximize your squat to parallel in powerlifting, you likely should include mostly squats to parallel, with the exception of, for example, if you want to maximize hypertrophy, in which case it seems as though a full range of motion or a partial range of motion at long muscle lengths is your best aim. So those were sort of the two main ones. I think specificity of range of motion is a thing, and also it seems as though training at long muscle lengths is beneficial for hypertrophy compared to training at shorter muscle lengths or doing a full range of motion.
Something that I found quite interesting as arguably the most important author of the meta-analysis, the senior and lead author and second author and third author, the sole author, and what's the word for somebody who inspired the paper?
Inspiration?
The influence of this paper. Anyways, joking aside, the one thing that I found interesting was the lack of, the variation in definition for full range of motion in the literature.
Yeah, indeed. So one exercise you often see used is a squat, and some studies didn't even try to sort of standardize squatting depth. So they would say, oh, we're doing a half squat, but that was very ill-defined and was sort of left up to the participants in terms of how low they squat and that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of heterogeneity, so essentially differences between studies. They're not all the same in terms of how they implement range of motion, in terms of how they control range of motion during the study and so forth. But on the whole, when you simply compare a partial range of motion to a full range of motion, full being not really full necessarily, but just being longer, So I guess it would be more range of motion versus less range of motion a lot of these times. And also, range of motion is ultimately individual, which means my full range of motion doesn't look like yours in all likelihood.
Facts.
Indeed.
But yeah, I found that very interesting because people, and I guess that's something we're also trying to bridge here with this podcast. When you hear, oh, we reviewed the literature and it was full ROM versus partial ROM, especially given how full ROM and partial ROM are presented by some of the evidence-based folk on YouTube and on other podcasts, people may assume that, oh wow, we had these really tightly controlled studies of people interested in maximizing hypertrophy, and we put them through an ass to grass squat, like almost touching the ground, versus a parallel squat, when in reality it was a quarter squat versus a parallel squat in a lot of the studies, and the training the populations differed, and it's not like every study you looked at was trying to establish whether full versus partial range of motion is best for hypertrophy or strength, right?
Indeed, correct, yeah. And I think that's a question you have to ask yourself, is this relationship between range of motion and the outcome we care about, does it hold up to the extremes? Like, for example, do isometrics at long muscle lengths produce the same hypertrophy outcomes as, full range of motion reps? If, for example, you find that there's no difference between a full range of motion and a partial range of motion. You have to think about that in terms of a spectrum, right? Yep. On one end of the spectrum, you have isometrics, which is no range of motion at all. And on the other end, you have a full range of motion being as much range of motion as you can do. Mm-hmm. We actually did perform a meta-regression analysis, so essentially looking, okay, when the range of motion performed in the partial range of motion condition was close to 0% of the full range of motion, say 10% or what have you, like a very small amount. Like let's say you're moving 1 meter during full range of motion, it would be something like 0.10 meters. When the amount of range of motion used in the partial range of motion condition was that small, did we see a difference in outcomes? We performed that analysis, but the issue is relatively few studies actually provided data necessary to run an analysis, and so there just wasn't enough data to be like, okay, the relationship between range of motion actually holds up even when you're doing really little range of motion or when you're doing like 90% of the full range of motion. So I'm not confident to say, okay, after you get 60% of the range of motion, you get all the benefits. I'm not comfortable in saying, like, this is how it works in terms of the relationship between range of motion and the outcomes we care about.
So in terms of practical takeaways, I'll give my take after yours, but what would you say are some practical takeaways for that lifter who wants to implement who wants to maximize hypertrophy and cares about using the most appropriate range of motion to do that?
Sure. For hypertrophy, I would recommend definitely biasing your training towards including longer muscle lengths. So, for example, as far as exercise selection goes, include exercises that involve long muscle lengths. So when you have the option, say, between a partial range of motion exercise that only includes short muscle lengths or a partial range of motion exercise that includes long muscle lengths, include the long muscle length one. Generally, a full range of motion, in my view currently, is likely only going to be better superior to a partial range of motion rep if it includes longer muscle lengths. So I don't necessarily think you need to perform full range of motion on all exercises for hypertrophy. I think provided that the range of motion you're using is predominantly the longer muscle length one, and you have some shorter muscle length training in your program, you're covered. I think including some shorter muscle length training in your program is potentially helpful. I'm still out on that, I'm not 100% sure. But maybe because different ranges of motion target different areas of a muscle in terms of regional hypertrophy, which we also looked at, and that sort of stuff. So for exercise selection, predominantly focus on longer muscle length exercises. You can experiment with stuff like pausing at the fully lengthened position. So for example, in a squat, pausing at the very bottom might be better than not pausing there, essentially allowing you to spend more of your set and getting more tension in that lengthened position. That might be helpful. Alternatively, you can also do something called a stretch superset, lengthen superset, which is essentially when you're taking a set with full range of motion to a certain RP, reps in reserve, or to failure, and then immediately following this, I would say with the same weight, essentially just keep going, but doing the first half or so of the concentric phase. So that would be the half of the range of motion that's more lengthened. And that's kind of a good middle ground approach where if you're not super confident that, the evidence is clear that we need to be doing a lot of long muscle length work, that can allow you to get a good amount of short muscle length work in still, because you're doing a full range of motion for the first part of the set. And then for the second half of the set, you're getting that bias on the low muscle lengths. So I think those are two or three tips you could incorporate into your program based on the evidence now. And to be clear, it's not just the meta-analysis. There's a lot of adjacent evidence. So for example, there's the isometric training literature, where they compare isometric training at different muscle lengths. And generally, longer muscle length training results in greater hypertrophy. Then there's the partial range of motion literature, where they compare the same range of motion in terms of angular motion, say 50 degrees of range of motion at different muscle lengths. And generally, out of, I want to say 6 studies, 4 of them or 5 of them find better hypertrophy after longer muscle length training. And then there's the more obscure evidence, let's say, for example, the animal studies back in the day. Now, I don't want to say this is like directly applicable to human lifters now.
I want to say that it's directly applicable to human lifters. Sue me.
There you go.
Objection, hearsay.
But there is evidence in animal models, for example, where it seems like even just generally stretching muscles at long muscle lengths for extended durations of time is beneficial for hypertrophy. And there's even recent evidence, so a study came out like a month ago, where they had people stretch out their calves for an hour a day at a sort of moderate intensity for 6 weeks, and they saw substantial hypertrophy there as well. So in general, it just seems like training at long muscle lengths is a really good idea for hypertrophy. The exact mechanism as to why, not super clear.
Cool. And how about, that's all very interesting. Obviously, my reaction was not as shocked because I have 1, read the paper, and 2, we're friends, so I'm all about those long muscle, brothers. I'm all about those long muscle length supersets. And now that, for example, I had this new tattoo done, and it obviously some of it was at the crease here, my arm, and I couldn't really flex my arm, especially during the first days, to not stretch the tattoo. It was a great chance for me to do some lengthened sets and placebo myself that, hey, at least I'm not losing gains. But how about the individual? We'll talk about strength in a second, but how about the individual who is not necessarily you or I, doesn't really care to become an animal / freak beast, and just wants to, train, get bigger, stronger, well, like get bigger, build a solid physique, but doesn't really care about optimizing? Any tips there? How can you make it super simple? Because that person may be hearing, lengthened supersets, exercise selection. What do you think is their best bet?
Sure. So a good default approach might be to lift with as much range of motion as you can and make that consistent so that you can track progression and make sure you're lifting sufficiently hard over time. Because ultimately, the effect sizes we're talking about here between partial range of motion and full range of motion for that outcome or this outcome, they're trivial to small for the most part. And so if you don't want to overcomplicate stuff, lift with a consistent range of motion. I would advocate for a full range of motion, depending on what you're trying to train for. Like if you're trying to maximize your squat, for example, it might be different. If you're trying to maximize your hypertrophy, it might be slightly different. But a full range of motion approach covers you decently well for a lot of things. Make that consistent so you can track progression and ensure you're training sufficiently hard. And yeah, that's basically it.
Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. How about the strength-oriented folk? You mentioned ROM being, ROM for strength being specific to the exercise that you're practicing.
Indeed. So that was actually a finding I was kind of surprised, but also relieved to find.
Were you surprised?
I was surprised in the sense that part of me was like, what if it turns out to be incorrect? Like I sort of had that doubt in my mind that a lot of findings that you think are inherently logical, right? Like specificity. Have we seen it tested directly a lot? How would you even test that directly, Mm-hmm. Like no study directly sets out to test specificity. They set out to test sort of smaller aspects of specificity, or like comparing different volumes and so forth. Specificity is quite a broad principle in a sense. Like in terms of specificity would apply to exercise selection. It would apply to range of motion. It would apply to the duration of exercise. It would apply to the frequency. Like it would apply to a lot of things, right? But so I was relieved to see that it actually did apply, where if you train with a partial range of motion, you got stronger at that range of motion than someone who trained with a full range of motion, just because you spent more of your effort essentially training that range of motion. And so for someone who's strength orientated, strength being 1 of max strength or 5 of max strength, what have you, Generally, for those endeavors, I would advise to have some of your training be in that range of motion exclusively. So, for example, let's say you're a powerlifter squatting. I would say some of your training, especially leading up to when you're maxing out, should definitely be just that range of motion. So some of your sets should be just squatting to depth with those exercises. And then because hypertrophy past the sort of intermediate stage where you've learned a lot of the technique to a lift and you've maxed out a lot of the neuromuscular aspects of strength, because hypertrophy plays such a huge role, you likely would want to apply some of the findings of the meta-analysis on muscle hypertrophy to your training as well. So in the off season, for example, it might be worth incorporating some longer muscle length partials, or maybe in general, training through a longer range of motion than you usually would for the lift itself, if that means you're getting longer muscle lengths incorporated. So for example, for a squat, again, if in the off season you're trying to put on muscle, which is a good idea, you might either want to do some partials at the bottom, or you can try and incorporate some full range of motion squats where you're actually going deeper than you usually would for the sake of getting hypertrophy in your off season.
That's an interesting claim. Are we about to take off, Dr. Cat?
Dr. Cat, ready for takeoff.
Can they see him on this? Anyways, he's about to jump to nowhere. Just a closed door. Anyways, the claim about muscle mass and strength would be very interesting to have Samuel Buckner as a guest on the podcast to potentially discuss the nuances of that topic, as it is a topic that is somewhat of controversial topic, I'd say, in a way. Obviously, there's some data to suggest. Well, it's a big discussion, but yeah, interesting. I would agree with you for the most part that a powerlifter could incorporate that, especially in other exercises where they may be able to, use less weight and in general have a more efficient setup, a less fatiguing setup. Going ass to grass might make sense. But yeah, sorry. Side note, sidetracked ADHD. I can say it. Diagnosed. So just to back away, we have the meta-analysis, which showed, well, with a question mark and some asterisks next to those takeaways, that, hey, long muscle lengths, probably a good idea to include them and bias your exercise selection towards exercises that will work your muscles in long muscle lengths. Now, in terms of the rest of the studies, any sort of preliminary takeaways, especially from the interview and the survey study, that you can share with us?
Yeah, so with the survey study and the interview study, it's important to keep in mind that a lot of my sample is, following evidence-based people. That's how I got the people to take part in the first place. So I wouldn't take it as being, this is how all people train, because it's not a very representative sample. But in general, it seems as though most people avoid a full range of motion, or I guess avoid using a full range of motion or a partial range of motion for either because they think it's more effective that way, because they're managing an injury. So for example, they are injured already and maybe doing a full range of motion might cause it to get worse, or at least they perceive it to be that way, because they want to avoid injury. So some people think that using a partial range of motion is inherently more injurious, or vice versa. Or finally, out of preference. Preference is relatively rarely cited as a reason for it. Generally, in my sample, most people train with a long range of motion. Relatively few people preferred a partial range of motion across the board. When they did, it was often with rationales such as metabolic stress or active tension on the muscle and that sort of stuff. So it seems as though, I think certain studies on range of motion, specifically there was one on the tricep where they measured blood lactate, during the sessions using a partial range of motion versus a full range of motion. And it seems like there is some potentially misconception around mechanistically what partial range of motion and full range of motion do. Like if the range of motion researchers and, for example, myself don't know what's going on exactly as to why longer muscle lengths, for example, are beneficial for hypertrophy, I wouldn't try and, as someone who's not familiar with the research, I wouldn't try and be like, this is why I'm doing this. I would say, on the whole, it seems like this is better for hypertrophy, and that's why I'm doing it. But as to why it's better, we're not clear,
So the big question that comes here. Obviously, there will be a follow-up episode after you've finished writing up the interview and the survey studies, because that will give you a bit more clarity in terms of some more potential practical takeaways, and obviously the intervention study, which will be one of the few intervention studies out there, and I'm looking forward to the results of that and also potentially participating. That said, the big question, and I think the question that everybody has, is where the bros right.
What do the bros do?
Well, nice. You followed up with another question and completely threw me off. But what I think a lot of the bros did was partial reps at long muscle lengths without justifying it like that. So, a lot of the bros.
Honestly, I don't think they. Maybe intuitively on some exercises they were right? Like some bros would do. I don't know. I'm thinking of
leg press.
Leg press. And leg press is usually it's actually the shortened part they would do.
Would they? I mean, it depends.
They don't get much depth usually, the bros, right? Same with benching, where oftentimes they wouldn't touch your chest.
They would cut it off there. It depends on which bro you looked at. But
I know, it's almost like they're not all the same.
Yeah, there were some that would
do this. Yeah. Honestly, I think they might have been right in some ways and wrong in others.
That's a nice episode, though. I think that should be one of the next episodes. Where
With
the bros right? Yeah, because there's many things that have the bros have been doing that when the evidence-based community, parts of it became a bit of a cult. Bros became a bit of a, bro science, bro.
An iron cult?
Shots fired. This is who you invited to your podcast, and this is who you didn't. But shots fired from us as well. I don't know. I thought to pick up the Wolfpack bag and somehow connect it there, but I can't. There's too many cables here. So, yeah, that would be a top episode. In terms of future research, anything you'd like to personally see as the soon-to-be Dr. ROM, ROM expert, ROM addict?
Yeah, so what I'd like to see is more within subject designs. So I think the reason the meta-analysis is helpful in the first place is because you're combining the results of several studies into one big study, which sort of alleviates the issues with small sample sizes, right? If you do one study but it only has 10 people, the odds that those 10 people are super similar to the wider population, relatively small. But if you have, say, 100 people, 200 people, 300 people, and it's a fairly varied sample, or sample that's similar to the population you care about, which in this case is jacked guys, it makes for a much better study and we can draw more confident conclusions from it. So what I'd like to see is within subject designs, because they essentially take out a lot of the confounders that you see with between subject studies, where you're comparing person A or group A to group B, and those people might have different sleep, different stress, and so forth. And within subject design, you take away all those factors, and thus the data set or the data you get from it is a lot more powerful, and you can make better conclusions from it. So that's one thing within subject designs. Then another one would be generally more evidence in the upper body, because there's not that much yet. I would like to see a bit more regional hypertrophy, as far as using, for example, the ultrasound as a means of assessing hypertrophy, because that would then allow for us to see, okay, does a specific part of the range of motion bias more distal or proximal hypertrophy? And then finally, one more thing would be maybe controlling range of motion a bit more tightly and specifying it more openly in the research methods, because it can sometimes be hard to tell, okay, this is what range of motion they did in the study, and that's how the group's trained.
Yeah, non-stop. Oh man, don't knock over the camera, please. Dr. Cat, please get up the table, Dr. Cat. Milo was so Raz is my sister's cat who won't be here in a couple of days, and Milo was focusing, doing really well all this time. I think the camera lost focus as well.
Better.
Yeah, Milo was doing a great job focusing while the cat was literally
causing mayhem
here, doing his thing, but then he had to stop us. Yeah, continue.
Anyways, so within subject designs, mostly in the upper body, regional hypertrophy, so using methods like the ultrasound or MRIs, That would all be great. And then finally, I would just like studies to control range of motion more tightly. So actually specify, okay, this is the percentage of the range of motion we use. Like we used half the full range of motion for the partial range of motion condition, and this is the part that we use, right? Because then we can know, okay, this partial range of motion group, they're training in the shorter or longer muscle lengths. And that can allow us to say, okay, it seems as though longer muscle lengths really are beneficial when done for a partial range of motion compared to a full range of motion for hypertrophy. And in general, to be honest, at this point, there's a good number of studies comparing partial versus full range of motion for strength. There's a lot of like more obscure studies, but there's a lot of them now total. But there's not that many for hypertrophy, and so in general, I'd just like to see more hypertrophy studies, because so far I think there's 7 or 8, and that's not that many, considering how small the sample is for a lot of these studies.
I disagree with the point you made on authors reporting more details about the range of motion, because why would you report details on your methods in a study when you can't just, not write basic stuff that you need to? I mean, gatekeeping and, lacking, not disclosing stuff, not having open data, not replying to data requests. I think that's the way to go forward. And
you know what I think we should do?
This is making science better. Me gatekeeping my stuff and not sharing it with you and just saying full squat. It's full squat or half squat. Figure it out yourself.
You're
Brainiac.
literally keeping the secrets to yourself. I know the results of my meta-analysis. It's not been published yet. I'm getting stats. Or are you? That's what I thought. We should do an episode on open science or research practices and get 0 views.
And get James
but
here
do it
as
for
well.
ourselves. Yeah, we could actually. Yeah.
James for the James experience, aka the man that has highly influenced us into being, researchers and crack addicts. Mostly the latter, but yeah, crazy stuff. Because I helped a tiny bit. Well, I helped on the meta-analysis, and I had to look for the studies and at the studies that you did as well. And it was crazy to see that plenty of those studies were just either didn't properly report or just said full or half squat. Or they hate us because they ain't us.
Let's summarize, shall we?
Yes, we shall. So, PhD, pretty huge dick. Range of motion, blah, 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 blah. Long muscle lengths, do the lift, just go gym. The end. Now, no, just kidding. So, your PhD, range of motion, 4 studies.
Correct.
One of them being the literature review and meta-analysis.
Correct.
Interview, survey study, intervention study.
Correct.
Meta-analysis available potentially even when the episode is out. If it is, link in description. We'll add the link to the description when it's available as a preprint. Other few studies expected to be out in the public in the next year or so.
I'd say so, yeah.
Select exercises that bias along long muscle lengths.
For hypertrophy.
For hypertrophy, for strength. Keep it specific to your whatever depth or range of motion you need to work on. But if you're a strength athlete and you wish to increase muscle mass, potentially take the practical takeaways for hypertrophy and apply them as well. And future research remains to come and really answer the question partial versus full. Still some way to go. Anything else you want to add?
Yeah, that this doesn't really matter. Just go out and lift weights. Yes.
So unless you're being an absolute jackass about lifting weights and you're here doing this or here doing that, it's,
No, what I'm saying is we should stop the podcast. There's no point anymore.
Yes, reductionists. But yeah, in all seriousness, if you're lifting...
Stop overthinking it.
Stop overthinking it. Find something that you can keep consistently doing for time. And if you're a muscle geek and you really want to take it there, lengthened supersets, biasing, all the stuff that we just said, is probably a good idea, but don't think that it's the extra 20% growth.
It's actually 200%.
It's 200% growth and 200% pride and Greek spirit.
As a follower of Muscle and Feels, you get the scoop.
The literal scoop, pun intended. So, from us here at the lab, a.k.a. the office, a.k.a. the studio, we wish you whatever the outro is, Muscle and Feels, take over, get mogged, Kyriakos Grizzly, training session coming up in October. Terms and conditions apply.
It's been a pleasure.
Peace.